Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the stream. So I have with me today my colleague and friend, Dr. Ganga Shreedhar. Thank you
Okay,
so much.
hello everybody,
Oh, I
and
think you've
welcome to the
I think
stream.
you've
So
got
I
it.
have with me
Today. I've just done that. I've just doubled back. I was about to tell Ganga off for having her sound on unprofessionally, but it was actually me, the person who does this for a living. Let's start again. Ganga, thank you for coming on coming on the stream.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here.
So I'm excited, to talk about all things nudge and the environment. And there's a lot to talk about because we wrote a paper about this recently together, along with Stuart Mills. But the first thing I wanted to ask about was you, because I know that your background is very interdisciplinary. You've sort of sought for a place to express your interests in the environment and in other questions, and that's found you a bit of a nomad, right? You've sort of wandered between different disciplines. So could you talk us through that?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, and hi to everyone watching on the stream as well. So I'm originally from India, and I did I actually did science in school. And then I came across a textbook of a friend who did economics. And one of the things it said, I had no idea what economics was, honestly. And one of the things I first read was, oh, it's about how to understand what drives people to be better off and about what makes them happy. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I guess, I guess that's worth thinking about. And that's how I actually ended up into economics. I could have also done zoology, actually, because, there was an early sort of inkling that I want to do something around conservation and environmental stuff. So I really had to choose between economics and zoology, and I went for economics. So when I actually did economics for my undergrad, it was quite a traditional sort of degree, and in some ways, and I really couldn't identify with many of the assumptions, especially in things like microeconomics. And there was also my department actually at the time did very interesting other sorts of economics. I remember doing ecofeminism. I remember doing agricultural economics and development stuff. But actually, the main part of economics, which is the core of it, I couldn't really identify with or buy. So when I actually wanted to understand a bit how the world works, I said, okay, economics is not going to really help me if this is it. So it's not enough. So I actually did my master's in development, and that was much more interdisciplinary. I got exposed to a lot more sociology and anthropology and political economy stuff there, and philosophy, and that was really interesting. But then again, I thought actually to do policy work and to affect change at scale, you need economics anyway. So I worked for a few years in policy research in agriculture and food security, and then I ended up doing that's when I came to the UK, when I did my master's in public administration and public and economic policy. Really got back into the world of economics, got back into the world of things like policy impact evaluation and understanding the causes of things at the London School of Economics. And I said, okay, there's something here which needs unpicking. And so I ended up doing my PhD in environmental economics. So went away from policy back into economics again, but more applied economics. And then again, I got disillusioned because I was like, this is the traditional tools don't work. The assumptions don't work. So I did like a bit of a full circle. And so really, I started to get, because I was interested in environmental issues, I thought the biggest problem, the biggest cause of a lot of environmental issues is human activity. There's a lot of scientific consensus on this. If you look at the recent IPCC reports, increasingly scientists are sort of trying to hammer in the message that this is down to human activity at the industrial scale, at the systems level, but also the individual level. So that's when I got more introduced and interested in psychological and behavioral science. And that's where I sit now. So in terms of my nomadic career, it has been a bit all over the place, but I think that's been really helpful to understand environmental issues because they're complex.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah, more so, perhaps more so than anything else, right? I think you can benefit from that interdisciplinarity. And,
Exactly.
I mean, it's interesting. I don't want to say everybody should have that kind of journey because you can't be that prescriptive, but I do think it'd be beneficial for a lot of people just to see, because knowledge silos are just absolutely real. And economists, I mean, out of all people, have absolutely no clue what anthropologists think, how they do things, right? They don't have any clue really about the environment, the natural sciences, how natural scientists approach it. And I just think it's really beneficial. And I think it's interesting because although I haven't been quite as nomadic as you, a lot of what you expressed resonates with me because I just did a straight economics degree, master's, PhD, right? But like you, a lot of the assumptions didn't really resonate with me, and I just, for the most part, saw my degree as a bunch of maths that I needed to do to pass the exams, and like I wasn't necessarily bothered about whether or not it represented the real economy, right? And then, like you, I kind of veered into behavioral economics because it was like, well, okay, at least they're actually saying, let's look at how people behave, you know, even if it's flawed, at least they're looking at experiments and they're looking at other data and they're actually asking people, real people, like what they do and what they think, right? So that was kind of a bit of an escape for me, and that's how I ended up at PBS, right? Because I was like, oh well, this is behavioral science is another step beyond just behavioral economics. It's like there are actually psychologists here and biologists as well in the department, and you know, people like yourself who may be very interdisciplinary. So it's really interesting, I think, how alienating an education in economics can be, right?
Absolutely, because I think a lot of the times the assumption sort of box us into there's this famous saying, right? All models are wrong until they're useful, or whatever, box. Um, I used to believe that for a while. And then sometimes now I'm just like, actually, when models are wrong, they're so wrong.
Yeah.
And they can really lead you astray in terms of the policy prescriptions. And the way to deal with this is actually work together with people who do have competing models and think about actually what the empirical reality is and how that fits with different theoretical traditions. And so from that sense, I think there is a space for theory, but I do believe that greater interdisciplinary work is really the way to go about it, because there's a value in particular perspectives. But I think the real value, especially when dealing with complex problems, is when you bring those perspectives together and have that dialogue at the policy level as well as the academic level, keeping the reality and the ground reality in mind. So that's why in my work now, I'm really trying to work with people like conservation biologists who do have a different training and who see the world a particular way, but also using different methodological traditions like mixed methods, which involve both qual and quant work. Because especially if you're going with the view of understanding a space and it's an alien space to you, you can't go in with a priori assumptions of this is what human nature is like. That just doesn't work. And then that's, I think, one of the biggest reasons I think I still stick with behavioral science in a way is because there is so much conversation about how the environment can change the way people not just behave, but also perceive reality. And that's quite interesting. And I think that's one of the reasons I think intuitively, in a way, I found a home a bit. But also the fact that you can be flexible and still incorporate insights from other disciplines, because your focus is actually on trying to explain the ground reality. I think that's really where we need to do a bit more work anyway.
I think one person who springs to mind, who I know we both like, is Eleanor Ostrom, right? So you know, she was very informed by economic theory, and I'm pretty sure her like background was originally in game theory, like some of the very mathematical
science.
Oh, sorry, no, it was political science, and but then she was doing game theory, right, and like abstract and mathematical, and then she sort of said, well, what if I go and actually look at some people and places and see how they actually do things? And I think her game theory, it did structure what she was thinking, because she was very focused on the free rider problem. You know, are people going to take advantage of collective resources? But you know, in the end, her analysis really was just exactly what you said, right? Going to a space, trying not to have too many prior assumptions, seeing how people do things, and, you know, building an understanding based on that. And it's always very complicated, and it's very difficult to make generalizations.
Absolutely. And I think I'm glad that you brought her up, because she was also someone who used mixed methods in her analysis and was very humble about the power of her own knowledge system to explain things there, but was able to really speak to that critically. So, you know, she questioned the very tenets of game theory, right? The way we think about the free rider problem as being basically, for instance, the commons as being characterized by the lack of property rights, which gives people bad incentives. But she really distinguished between commons, which are collectively governed through informal institutions like social norms, and psychological factors like the impulse to cooperate, but also make a very clear distinction between that as something which is actually a self-governing commons as different from the absence of private property, which leads us all to ruin because of some weird Hobbesian nature that we all have, which is just a chaos because we're all selfish, right? So she was able to see sort of the nuance there that, okay, there is an impulse to cooperate, but also be selfish. And really a lot of it depends on how institutions locally are structured, not just some unavoidable facet of human nature.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's this kind of armchair philosophy, I think, that like structures that the original interpretation of that problem. If you read the original Garrett Hardin paper, he's just sort of making stuff up. Also a massive racist who wanted like eugenics and population control, which I think is relevant because his view of humanity was just like, oh, we're just going to proliferate over the globe and not be able to govern ourselves. Special emphasis on obviously non-white, non-Western people, right, doing that. And it's just like it's so wrong, and you know, morally abhorrent as well.
And it
that's
also
the
comes
basis
from a
for it.
particular historical place. And it comes from a particular historical circumstance. Whereas when we think about human nature, we think of it as ahistorical, something unchanging. Whereas actually our understandings of that are actually quite contextually informed, depending on who you have in mind, who you study, the ideology you bring to the table. And I think that's one of the things I think a lot of qualitative researchers do is sort of try to position themselves at the front of their research and sort of you really think about their own positionality. Whereas when we think of more mathematical economic theories, often that part is quite missing.
Yeah, there's this kind of like, who am I? If you're interviewing someone, right, you get this. I mean, I'm reminded of Elizabeth Stokey that we work with, right? She does qual research and she has these really interesting presentations she does about phone calls to 999 or 911 that first the woman acts like she's ordering a pizza and keeps doing it until the person on the receiving end of the call gradually realizes she's not ordering a pizza. She's a victim of domestic abuse, right? And it's like that as soon as you start talking to people, I think positionality is what you called it, right? It's like, who am I, right, in this? Am I like a powerful figure? Am I an authority? Am I like an agent of the state? Do they trust me? What about the wording of what I say, right? Are they saying what they mean, or is it implicit, like in Elizabeth's examples? So it just opens up an entirely new world compared to just either building an abstract mathematical model, armchair philosophizing, is that a word? Or like even getting a data set, right, and just downloading a data set and taking all the answers for granted. You need to do more to understand the social world.
Yeah, I mean, even data collection is an interesting process, right? So the way people interpret the questions can often leave a lot of room to actually what we're collecting. Like it's different if you have behavioral data, which is say revealed, where you've got like, I don't know, the number of phone calls someone makes. But actually why people make those phone calls, the motivation behind that and the sort of mental states behind that can be so subjective. So you can ask people questions and there's a lot of debate about this in the literature. But the baseline is, you know, data is data and you have to interpret all of that with the caveats of whether it's incomplete and how people read those questions, whether the same tool has the same meaning in way it's interpreted across different contexts. So I think when we start to really get into this and are a bit more critical towards actually the tools we're using, I think there is quite a good, strong case to make to use these sorts of multiple methods to understand the same sort of question.
It always bothers me when you get people sort of looking at GDP estimates in like sub-Saharan Africa from the year 1050. It's like you don't have that. That doesn't mean anything in that context, right? Like, how did you get that, and what relevance do you think it had to the people there at the time? It's just absurd.
Yeah, actually, David Graeber and Wenger's book is a nice place to really think about like what we actually know about the past. And you're talking about future forecasting data, but also historical data. How, you know, I think that's also a really interesting space, which shows you could use things like archaeological data to think about the knowledge gaps we have and actually how little we know about the past, and how that has huge implications for what we think about grand narratives of progress and lack of progress and things. So yeah, I'm sort of midway to that, and I recommend that.
I haven't started it yet. I really do need to. Yeah, I mean, it's just funny when you hear, you know, because you can hear you can watch a documentary and you can be like, oh, you know, the people in the Bronze Age were doing this. And then when you go into the archaeology, it's like, how do you know that? And they're like, well, we found one tip of a spear in this place, and it's like engraved in such a way that we think, and it's like, oh my god, like we don't actually know anything. I mean, I don't want to get too nihilistic, but sometimes I'm like, what, do we actually know anything about the past?
Yeah. I think the point is to be humble about what we do know,
Mm,
and then seek to sort of constantly, work with people who do have different perspectives
yeah, yeah.
and see if what we know generalizes in
Yeah.
any way.
So let's move to like the more immediate issues of behavioral science in the environment, because
Yeah.
what the reason that I'm talking to you ostensibly is that we wrote a paper together, and I actually shared it on my channel, so I don't know if some of the people who've joined might have read it, but it was about what we called brown sludge.
Yeah.
Which is basically a way of a series of impediments to pro-environmental behaviours. And the paper was actually your idea. I remember you sort of proposed it to me in the corridor one day at LSE. So what was your motivation for this?
Yeah. So, I mean, when behavioral science and the whole nudge literature really took off in the policy space, and this would have been in the 2000s onwards, there was a lot of hope, I think, and maybe naivete about what the potential was of more psychologically informed interventions to change behavior. And of course, there's a whole political economy around this in the sense of, it was quite focused on individual level behavior change. And it brought in that lens. And that lens was essentially that actually, in many ways, people make mistakes because they're rational. And they're rational because they have these sort of deviations from rational choice theory, some of the micro assumptions that we were talking about before, that people are selfish or people have perfect knowledge, perfect foresight, things like this. And because of that, they often take these decisions which are against their best interests. So a lot of that literature in the early stages of nudge, in my understanding, was often focused towards things like financial well-being, health decisions, and so on, right? Now, the environmental issue in terms of climate change or mass extinction, which is something else I study, really is about not just what makes people better off as defined by themselves, but also what makes society more stable, more cohesive, better off as a whole, but also non-human societies, right? If you think about actually an ecosystem being stable and integral and functioning, right?
Mm,
So in that sense, there was a lot of excitement as, okay, you know what, let's also think about how to apply these nudges to situations where there are externalities, where externalities in an economic sense was defined as basically impacts on a third party, right? And they could be positive or negative. The typical illustration of this might be something like air pollution, which causes climate change. So you drive a car and that, you might be better off because you get to where you need to go quicker, but then there are these social effects, which might be negative, things like congestion, pollution, and so on, which have a negative externality on people around you who have nothing to do with the choice of you to drive a car, right? So the idea was like, can you also use nudging to say improve public transport use? Could you also use nudging to improve people to recycle better? And the way that was typically done was through changing the way you present information. So drawing attention to what other people were doing, for instance, pulling on things like social norms, social comparisons. Some of the most famous nudge experiments in this case was done on utility bills, where you show not just what your own consumption was, but also your neighbor's consumption.
yeah.
Another way to do this was change the decision-making context, the choice architecture, right? By pre-selecting an option, but giving the people, the option to drop out. So, pre-selecting people to go with the green energy provider to reduce emissions from home energy use rather than, going with the default, which is often a gray provider. So renewables versus non-renewables and so on. So there was a lot of conversation about how we could use these sorts of approaches which don't put a financial cost on the decision through typically things like a carbon tax or a fee for recycling or something, or they don't put any bans and restrictions or mandates on how people ought to behave. And a lot of this literature did come from the US, right? So there was a lot of, concern around things like personal freedom,
Yeah.
and not actually, impinging on that. But also, on another hand, we do have a real contention that actually a flat tax on people might be regressive, especially from an environmental perspective, if people who are worse off in society or who have lower disposable income tend to consume dirty products.
Yeah.
So just a flat tax on them means that that tax would be regressive. So there are also fairness and distributional
That's where you
concerns.
get like the Gilets Jaunes protests in France, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So given this, like nudges was seen as sort of third way
Mm,
and sort of golden path. As more and more sort of evidence started to accumulate, there were three broad issues. One thing was nudges, the type of nudge and the effect of each nudge didn't generalize across different contexts,
mm,
right? So just because a nudge worked for one behavior in one population, it might not have worked in another behavior in another population. So a nudge works on recycling towel use in the US, but not in Germany, for instance, in a
yeah.
hotel, right? That's a typical example paper, which didn't generalize, right? Another issue was the fact that the effect sizes were really small,
Mm,
right? So you'd actually want to put a fair amount of time into designing a good nudge, especially because the effect sizes were quite large, but the effect sizes were actually quite small. So what that meant was essentially, if the nudge was successfully scaled up across the population, that might have compensated for a small effect size. But if it was small, non-generalizable, and it didn't
mm,
scale up very much either, then that was an issue. And that brings us to the third problem, which is actually there were questions about whether there was actually a long-term effective nudges. So once a nudge was in place, did it actually persist? And in all these cases, there was a huge debate about whether they actually worked,
mm.
right? Often because the way in the academic literature, at least, and even in some policy literatures, it was pitched was nudge could be seen as a third way, not as one of the many ways that you use to address
Yeah.
climate change,
Yeah.
right? So there was this big conversation about whether they work or not, which has been quite active in the literature and behavioral science over the past few years. Lots of papers about it. Where our paper sort of came into it and my thinking came into it was, but there are real structural and systemic issues which reduce their efficacy,
Mm,
but which also create a strong case for using multiple sorts of policy instruments, whether they're financial instruments like taxes and subsidies, whether that's actually a case for big investments in infrastructure, whether that's a case for actually good regulations, which are things on like minimum water quality and standards and like, compliance laws and so on. So if you really think about the range of tools we have to address something like climate change, we've got a whole range of tools and they're all there for a reason and they all have their strengths and limitations. So one way I was thinking about encapsulating that and presenting that in the context of the nudge literature was actually we live in fossil fuel structures, right? Um, our systems are often built on quite brown infrastructures.
yeah.
So in that sense, actually, we live in quite a sludgy setup. And a sludge would be typically seen as an opposite of a nudge, things that make it harder for us to do the right thing rather than easier for us. And that's how I started to think about this more. It's not just that nudges don't work. They don't work because our contexts are fundamentally brown, right?
Mm,
And that does mean that you need a range of policy instruments, not just nudges, to address this issue. Because by relying on nudges, not just will you run into this issue of will it generalize? Are the effect sizes small? Will they be long lasting? You're likely to find they're going to be small, not long lasting, because
mm.
your structures which fundamentally go against green behavior. And in doing so, it's not just about individual choice, but also the social responsibility that we have as companies, as governments, to actually do something about it, because the origin of the problem is not just individual.
Yeah. It's kind of well, it's fighting against thunder, right? I suppose is one way of putting it, right? If you've got like, I was trying to think of a non-disgusting way of saying that, but there's also pissing into the wind. But for some
Yeah.
reason, they're both. Yeah. Anyway, like, it's like there's something like that. Anyway, they're both like it's just there's so many structures, often physical structures, right? For example, one thing we talk about is roads and how cities are built around roads and
Yeah.
therefore cars as opposed to cycling and public transport. And it's just, if you're gonna change the label on some packaging, put a smiley face on a bike or something, you know what I mean? It's just really unlikely to have an effect. And I mean, you use the word naive, and I think a lot of nudges are quite naive in that way, isn't it? Because it is literally like just a silly little message or a text to someone and something like, and it's like, yeah, look at the margin. You're
Yeah.
probably going to improve uptake. I think it's fine to streamline. I mean, some of the processes that governments have used
Yeah.
pre-nudge were ridiculous. It was like you had to fill out like a 20-page form, and it's like, yeah, okay,
Absolutely.
let's streamline that. Let's nudge that and turn it into a
Exactly.
text. That's fine, but it's not going to solve any type of major problem, especially an environmental
Absolutely.
one.
Absolutely. So for a really good example of there's two broad things here, right? Maybe it's worth just spending a bit of time thinking about the two concepts. So not just simply some sort of a modification in the choice architecture, and the choice architecture is basically just your decision context where you
Mm,
make a choice, right? And the idea is to simplify that either through clever design, so physically, right? An example of that would be don't have sweets at the checkout counter. That's a classic example, right? Don't have
mm,
cigarettes at the checkout counter because those are temptation goods. Have something like fruits, right?
mm.
So you feel like picking up an apple rather than, a box of tobacco, whatever, right? So that would be like an example of physical changing in the infrastructure in your choice decision, or it could be informational. So, for instance, put particular sorts of information, whether it's visual. On a tobacco pack, the classic example is a picture of lungs, or it could be the way information is framed, what information is presented. So we spoke about like social comparisons, like what your neighbors do, right? Those are all things that are supposed to nudge people, make it easier for them to pick the right thing, rather unconsciously, actually. So
Mm.
it's not necessarily about changing preferences, right? Whereas your typical interventions, which ask people to do things, were often seen as educative nudges, so information campaigns which try to persuade people by presenting them more and more information, right? So often more and more and more information doesn't work. It exhausts people, they don't really pay attention to it. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, essentially. So the argument was present simple, salient information which gets the message across, right? And the converse of that was actually there are decision settings which are full of frictions, which make it quite hard for you to do the right thing. So simplify that. And that's kind of the idea of removing sludge. So an
Mm.
example of that, which we also talk about in the paper, is to apply for something like Green Homes Grant. The instructions on websites can be super unclear. There might be many providers, there might be many steps. Immigration paperwork is an example of where there's a lot of sludge
Mm.
because there's explicitly like a hostile immigration policy,
Yeah,
for instance,
exactly.
makes it quite difficult to
Yeah.
understand as someone who's done years of immigration paperwork, like
Yeah,
with
yeah.
a PhD and 2 masters, like it was hard for me to do. So, I can just imagine how much time that takes. So there's a time cost as well, apart from just the mental exhaustion of going through these things. So those would be examples of things that create sort of an uncertainty cost, a psychological cost of friction, and that's typically what sludge would be. In some cases, actually, you do need to do the due diligence for good paperwork, right? So
Mm.
sludge can be useful. But in many cases, to apply for Green Homes Grant, for instance, that shouldn't be the case. It should be simple. And that's where, for instance, there's a case to just simplify that process, and that could be a nudge. However, the fact is you still need a grant to insulate your home. You still need
Mm.
support to do heat pumps installation in your home, right? So that is still an incentive that the state is trying to provide homeowners to help cut energy costs, but also to help reduce emissions from energy use, right? So it's already in that example, you see how there's more than one policy instrument and how a nudge will not save the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Because you're already trying to basically simplify a process where you can get help to improve your home and reduce the social negative externality to society from excess emissions or wasting energy in the home.
I think there's also this issue as well, isn't there? And you raised it, especially with the immigration example, is like to frame this as a mistake, as a kind of
Yeah.
technocratic mistake that these processes are very difficult, is often to miss the point because they might be very difficult for a reason, and that could be incompetence and lack of understanding in some cases.
Yes.
But I think in other cases it's actually quite deliberate and it kind of works for the people who are designing the policies, right?
Exactly. And I think we've got the idea, and I think there's two things here, right? I think you've brought this, it's a really interesting point that you bring up. There's two broad things, right? One is actually there's an intentional sludge built into particular processes, which might help people to take more pro-environmental decisions, right? And that could be everything from city design to the fact that maybe there's an implicit assumption that actually taking calls are better socially because it's better for your status or
Mm.
something, right? So the way cities are
Yeah.
built and so on, right? Rather than thinking, okay, let's start with a case where public transportation should be affordable, free, and everyone should be able to access it and use it, and there should be well interlinked transport networks, right? So there might be something there in terms of intentionally what's happening in the policy space. But there's also this idea that people are irrational and that's bad, right? That's not to say that people don't behave in ways that might run counter to their best interests in terms of they can be impulsive, but also the frame that you start off as people are irrational and therefore in
Mm.
some way short, I think puts a lot of responsibility implicitly onto individuals for what are really complex societal systematic issues for which we should have players at multiple entities working together. You brought up Ostrom's work, right? At the beginning. So one of her ideas, for instance, is the idea of polycentric governance, which is the idea that individuals can come together to solve local environmental problems, but they feed into things like local government and advocacy groups, and that feeds into basically state, higher provincial government, and governments have to therefore come to fix the issues that individuals themselves can't solve by setting incentives right in the market. And then businesses also have to be compliant and held responsible, and you have to have long-term plans and be accountable to government. So because we're in a multi-level system with multiple players, not just individuals, nudges run the risk of sort of individualizing through the narrative of how they operate, and the idea that individuals are responsible as one of the core, you can help them be more responsible sort of narrative. There is this risk that you end up sort of not just depoliticizing and absolving higher entities from taking coordinated action to address the issue, but also transferring a lot of that guilt and load onto individuals.
Mm. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned climate change, right? Because it's like this idea of present bias, right? We are biased towards ourselves in the present. Now, in one way, that's one of the more robust findings from
Yeah.
behavioral economics. It's pretty clear that we value the here and now. We have a bit of trouble thinking about the future. We also have trouble thinking about probabilities and catastrophic events like I mean, look at the pandemic. We didn't really see it coming. We do have trouble with all those things. That is true. But it seems to me, and going back to Ostrom, the salient question is really how do we design our governance structures
Exactly.
such that we address those problems? Because while we do have present bias, we have multiple selves, right? And we have a political mind. And I think if you ask most people, do you want Bangladesh to be completely underwater, they're going to be like, well, no, and I would be in favor of action which address that. But if the governance systems don't bring out that person, that self, and they more appeal to the inaction, right, then you're going to observe more present bias. But it's really an artifact of how you've structured your governance, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think this is the key thing here when we think about like, how do we think our way out of this? It is around how do you design institutions that respect, both the freedom of individuals, but also not frame this as a trade-off because it is in people's interests in the long run. In the short run, it might not be, it might be a bit expensive or whatever, but and that's where you need the state to come in and think through how to resolve that issue along with people, right? You have to take people with you. So I think when often there are issues which are really interesting, right? For instance, NIMBYism, where people would be like, yeah, I'm up for wind energy, but maybe not in my neighborhood. But recent studies also show that there's bipartisan support for greater renewable energy. But then the state needs to show up and capitalize on that bipartisan support and think about ways to do this, right? Yet we don't see resultant government action also. So I think this is where we're sort of stuck, where actually we do need institutions to work with and bring out the best in our natures as well, which is this impulse to think long term. Also, the interest to hold multiple selves, like the impulse to cooperate, all those things do exist, but they need to be brought out in our institutional environments. And that's, I think, really where we need to see more thinking and more action. A really interesting case of this is actually when, since you're about unlearning economics as well. So Robert Frank in the 90s, I think, but this has been replicated even in my PhD. I sort of replicated this finding, was when you have a typical lab experiment where you call people into the room, into the lab, and you get them to take some decisions. Everyone's anonymous. There's no opportunities for interaction, right? And there's some sort of a commons dilemma. Could be a public goods game where you want to contribute to the public good and someone who's selfish, which is the economic model, would keep it and free ride. In a commons dilemma, you want to extract, right? So that's the one I did. We found that, and Robert Frank also finds that, you have when you have economists in the room, they expect other people to act selfishly. So their behavior sort of follows that belief expectation, and they contribute less because they're taught that that's what to do,
Yeah.
right? And those are the incentives they face. So I think it's similar to that, right? So I think there is a role for education, but also sort of rethinking how we understand people and their potential to cooperate. Because our beliefs, if you believe that people will be selfish, then you behave in a way that fulfills that belief. And I think then you do get these sorts of institutions which reflect that belief as well, right?
Yeah. It's like, I mean, in game theory for a long time, I think, and maybe still today, it has always assumed first that people are rational and selfish, but also it's very much focused on the outcomes of that behavior as opposed to the rules of the game. And it's like,
Yes.
how did you set up the game? Because that's the question we need to be asking, right? How do you set up the game? And
How
it's
do you
like,
set up a game?
yeah,
And this is the issue that you brought up with Hardin's original Tragedy of the Commons as well, right? Where you do have, when you set up the game, you come in with assumptions rather than, and often they're naive assumptions on what human nature is, on what the rules of the game are. So you think of a common property resource not as something that's governed by a group of people, but more sort of just lacking in private property rights. And that's a particular lens to bring into it, which then you will say those are the rules of the game. And then when you have predictions which bear out the rules of the game, it does become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And then when you do teach people that that's basically what people do, then they are expected to do that as well in these setups. And that's kind of why I think we need to really think through who writes the rules of the game, why do we have these rules, what happens when you have different rules.
I mean, it's interesting. Our co-author Stuart Mills is actually in the chat, by the way. He sometimes joins, but yeah, Stuart also wrote this paper. But it's funny because I was actually going to mention him anyway, because Stuart showed me an article by Barack Obama, I think, or it might have been David Cameron, or maybe it was both of them together. It was in the Guardian in like 2011, right? Who was literally just kind of saying what we've been saying, right? So it kind of, you can risk sounding a bit conspiratorial in a way when you say, why are these systems designed this way, blah blah, it's an excuse for governments. But if you read that article, whoever it was by, one of the heads of state, it was like he's literally saying it. He's like nudges the way to basically take governance decisions without taking governance decisions to avoid like these big questions.
Well, that's not surprising because both Cameron and Obama were one of the first government heads to sort of introduce behavioral science and nudging officially into government and the operation of government, right? And the idea was at the time to not restrict freedoms. So the idea was to also maintain the status quo for those who want to maintain the status quo. Now, if you do go by the scientific advice, by the IPCC's recommendations, that you do need to transform the way we do economics, but we also have to transform our societal institutions. They call for deep transformations, essentially, which is not just a change in our market structures and the way we do business, but also in values and things, because that's needed. They're not like, it's not a one or the other. So if you do want those deep transformations, that does mean fundamentally changing the status quo. And in that sense, there will be lots of resistance from people who benefit from the status quo. That's just, again, basic economics, right? Because, and it's also basic behavioral science, because you do know that people have a status quo bias. We do know, although the endowment effect doesn't generalize extremely well, there's also the tendency in some cases to fear, what you lose from the current status quo in terms of loss aversion and so on. So, I think in that sense, the idea of a nudge, in essence, is to give people the freedom to stick to the status quo, but that's not what you need for climate change. If you do go by the scientific advice, which is we need a systems transformation, then that's not going to cut it. It might be one of the things that you use along with other tools to really change the system over time and make sure people aren't left behind. But and that you take people with you, because that's the other big issue, right? You mentioned this Gilets jaunes protests.
Yes.
So if you don't really think about distributional concerns when doing this, I think you'll end up just polarizing people and then disabling any change, which works out well for people who benefit from the system anyway.
Stuart's corrected me. It was Thaler and Osborne together, apparently. So it wasn't either Barack Obama or David Cameron. Completely misremembered that. But Thaler and Osborne writing together, which is arguably even more interesting.
and
So
not
yeah,
spread.
no. So I mean, it's interesting because the democratic component comes into it as well, right? With something like the Gilets Jaunes protests, it's like you have to take these big governance decisions, but you have to bring people with you. And I think if you're saying there's status quo bias, and like you said, there's some questions about how that generalizes. I think it depends on people's expectations, right? Of like what's going to happen. I think you've got to show people an alternative, right? You've got to create a transformative alternative. If you're going to tell people don't drive your car, well, you can't just do that. You can't just say like either cars are banned or the price of petrol's doubled. If that's how they get around, you have to
Yeah.
give them an alternative, right? Of either walking, cycling, or public transport,
Yeah.
or whatever else.
Yeah, and I think this is basic when it comes to insights around habit formation
Mm,
and creation, right? So, for instance, if you want to break a bad habit, you also have to put in place another habit instead. You can't just get people to break a bad habit. And the point of habits, for instance, is the context is stable and you repeat that behavior again and again. Transport's a really good case for this, especially if you look at things like commuting, right? And what happened in COVID was really a fundamental change in that context. So lots of people's commuting behaviors just changed, right? And that's what scholars like Vas Plankin as well as Lorraine Whitmarsh would call like a transformative moment, where the idea is like that this really changed the rules of the game in a
mm,
sense. People didn't have to go into work anymore. There were different risks from commuting, on public versus private transport and so on. So you can have multiple effects there, right? Some people might choose to just have more flexible work days, work from home a lot more. Other people might actually choose to buy cars because they don't trust public transport if they were nervous or quite compromised. Other people might actually sell their cars because they don't need to go into work as much if you live in a city. But none of this would work in a rural context where maybe you just have poor public networks
mm,
of transport, unreliable trains and so on. So unless you make trains reliable and have a good rail network or a good bus network, in those sorts of cases, it's not reasonable to get people to not drive their cars because they're also used to it,
mm.
right? And it's also sort of feels unfair. So I think in those sorts of situations, this is another example where you can nudge people to reduce car use as much as possible, but it's just going to fall on deaf ears
Yeah.
because there's no good alternative
Mm,
or there's no feasible alternative, which people think is feasible and for good reason,
yeah.
right? So I think in those sorts of situations, that can explain why, for instance, nudges will fail because you can't nudge people when there's no good alternative,
Mm.
right? But it also is a good example of where you actually need big infrastructure investments um, to put those alternatives in place potentially. Um, but if they're missing,
Yeah.
you get this
You know.
illusion of people being irresponsible or not doing the right thing because they're selfish, when it's actually just quite a sensible thing to keep driving your car. Because what if you need to get somewhere for your kids' football, or
Mm.
you need to go to the hospital, or you just need to do your shopping and there's no, yeah.
The option's not there. I mean, I was speaking to Max Holleran, the urban sociologist, earlier this week, and we were chatting a lot about cities in America, and he was saying, look, okay, look, New York is a city, but actually a lot of cities in America are not. They're just massive, sprawling suburbs connected by freeways.
Mm.
And how do you expect people to get around, especially since you're not allowed to build shops near the houses either? It's just a suburban house, and you need to drive for 10 minutes to get milk. It's like you can't nudge people out of that. Like maybe, and to be clear, in terms of designing policy, behavioral science can help you, and nudge can help you, right? It's like make the process simple, make it easy, and all the rest of it. But like ultimately, it needs like resources, expertise, and just
You
a
need to
vision.
consult and you need to consult with communities, right?
Yep.
So an example of even in London where you've got like quite good public transportation, it might be an exception really to most cities in the world, right? Where you've got good public transport networks, good buses, and so on. But here, when you have new measures which are seen as pro-environmental, like low traffic neighborhoods, if it's not planned in consultation with local communities and their views are not taken on board, then you run the risk of, say, rerouting traffic and shifting pollution elsewhere, or communities not fully buying it. And something which is a good idea on paper, it becomes a bad idea in practice or becomes resisted by the public in practice. And then that alienates people from actually a cause they might quite believe in and agree with.
Mm.
So I think there's also room for like consulting not just experts, but also the public, because you need to understand how they actually use space, what they value from space. And I think that is a long deliberative process
Mm.
often. And that does require a bit of time, and that does require intentional action. And you can't just nudge away that, you know?
Absolutely. Let's talk about climate denial, because I think this relates to the general picture we were painting. But one of our examples was climate denial and disinformation, right? And how behavioral science can help that. And this stuck in my mind really because we uncovered this paper from 1979 arguing that behavioral scientists needed to cooperate with natural scientists to combat climate disinformation. And so we've already had a go at behavioral science and economics and maybe some other stuff, but let's have a go at natural scientists now, because they were very dismissive. And I think what we don't want to do here is be dismissive of behavioral science and social science in general. It's just the narrow application of nudge. Because natural scientists were like, well, no, climate change is real. We've got the facts on our side. We just need to write loads of papers and long reports, right? And then people will believe it. And then, you know, you have the whole history of climate denial is like natural scientists just having rings run around them on TV debates by like bad actors who are just really talented at, you know, rhetoric and all the rest of it, right? So, I mean, how do you think behavioral science can help us address this kind of disinformation? Because that's one role for it.
Yeah, I think there's maybe two, three broad ways. So the first thing is I think one of the first early forms of climate denial took the form of basically, you know, disinformation campaigns that spread that climate change was not caused by humans. So it cast climate change as a natural phenomena. And often the narrative there was that, listen, the climate's always changed in the history of the earth. And, you know, so the core bit of information that scientists brought to the table at that time was actually there's been an acceleration in global warming in a historically short period of time. The famous hockey graph is the one that typically comes up here. And that is unnatural. And that's why it's attributed to human activity. And it's clearly linked to fossil fuel emissions, post the Industrial Revolution, and so on, right? So I think this was the debate. So casting climate change as not anthropogenic, but as natural, absolves people from action. And a lot of the times, I think, one way to combat that is actually just correct the misinformation cognitively. So that does mean educating people and making sure that people know that this is actually attributed to humans. So some of my research, but also other research shows that actually when you attribute the causes correctly of the problem, it's important to inform the types of solutions you support. So if you attribute the cause of climate change, but also biodiversity loss and things to human action, whether that's pollution, land use change, and so on, that does mean you're able to support policies, but also take personal behavior change, or you're willing to do it, even if you don't. I haven't actually measured if people do it, but that's a big debate anyway. But you're willing to support behavioral change, which does speak to those root causes. But if you diagnose the cause wrong, then you absolve yourself from the responsibility. So if you see it as caused by a natural thing, then it's like, what can we do about it? A bit of fatalism creeps in, but also demobilization. And then you have a whole scale sort of disavowal of science and mistrust in science and so on. Now, a separate debate is why people trust and don't trust science, but we can leave that aside, right? So I think the first thing is actually to correct that misinformation. The second thing is also framing. So how you frame the issue. So most people sort of, you know, and all these sort of framing, correcting misinformation, cognitions, and so on are small solutions to the problem, which are important for, I think, long-term having an accurate understanding of what's going on, which is, I think, really important in a democratic society, but any society as well, right? Other ways, I think, you know, I think in this is where nudges are typically brought up, because people are like, okay, there are systematic ways you can say have inoculation against fake information. So train people to figure out how the information is fake. And in that sense, you can basically try to think of misinformation or disinformation as a virus. So you can figure out like how to immunize people against this. So behavioral scientists try to do a bit of research there as well. There have been effects which have been shown on things like intentions and beliefs. It's not clear how they generalize to behavior or if they generalize as well. So that's another way. So all of these are more sort of information campaigns and like framing and nudges and things. Apart from education campaigns, so proper science education in school, which is a lot more resource intensive and less nudgy, right? And then others would argue the way we should do this is just a clever design of institutions. So things like taxes, good mandates, holding companies to account. So climate litigation has come up a lot. So if you're found guilty of spreading misinformation or delaying climate change, then take it to the courts. Like that's another way entirely, which behavioral science has not said much about at all, but that is happening
Mm.
as well. And this is where conversations about greenwashing and carbon washing, and misleading investors and things will come in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is one of the really interesting things that came out of this debate is like how much not just natural scientists but academics couch their language in uncertainty and sort of like yeah, well, we think we know this, right? Whereas people who are denying climate change are much more like, no, the climate's definitely not warming, it's definitely not due to human action, like this
Or
is a
they
lie.
ex or they sort of emphasize the uncertainty,
Yeah.
right? So they sort of emphasize what's in the tails.
Yeah.
Um, and they
Mm.
emphasize the uncertainty, which therefore increases the doubt you have in your mind that maybe the science has a consensus. So another way of combating this from the behavioral science has been to emphasize the scientific consensus on this. So Naomi Oreskes' work does a lot of this, where they sort of interview a lot of climate scientists or survey them and think about like what's the consensus in the science. And if you communicate that consensus, for instance, 99.7% or something of scientists sort of agree that climate change is happening and caused by humans, that sort of scientific consensus can induce greater confidence in the science, but also reduce that perception of uncertainty. Something else which we do find is narratives of disinformation often present this two sides debate, where it's like, and it's very hard to combat this because it becomes like personalized narratives rather than scientific like
Yeah.
evidence.
Yeah.
So it becomes like there was this one incident and this happened because an individual, for instance, went through this and then there's this other perspective and this is what this other individual thinks. And we know that when we contend with multiple narratives, especially if they're personalized or rooted in two personalities, we tend to give equal weight to them and often remain ambiguous or confused or uncertain ourselves because you're like, on the one hand, on the other hand, right? So often you'll find disinformation campaigns sort of couching in these sorts of personalized narratives. And that often induces confusion in people as well. And that's quite difficult for the science to combat because the science is about like this percentage confidence in this particular path or trajectory,
One
which is a
of
lot more
yeah.
abstract and
Um,
difficult to
I
understand.
mean, one thing which springs to mind are the more deliberative, democratic participatory
Yeah.
forums, right? And I think Ireland's experimented with these quite a lot. And I'm pretty sure, am I
UK
misremembering
had some
here?
climate assemblies as well.
Yeah, there were some climate assemblies, right? And that tends to reduce denial. And I guess it's not personalized, is it? Because there's so many people, and
But it
everyone has a
also
say.
puts, yeah, and it also puts scientists into conversations with people.
Mm,
So you often have a representative sample and that cuts across whatever parameters people putting together the participative, sort of assembly, sort of, it could be age, gender, ethnicity, political background, whatever, depends on what the criteria are, but you have some sort of representative sample of people who come together, typically reflecting a diversity of opinions about an issue. And then you put them in touch with scientists and experts, and they get to have a conversation, which is a sort of structured conversations over a number of days. The existing evidence sort of shows, I think, that people tend to actually reduce polarity. So, like, if polarization reduces. However, I think there's a question as to what do you do with these findings? What does the government do with these findings? Right. So, if people do agree on a set of actions, how they're actually implemented is a separate thing. And what that actually means for the governance of the problem itself might be a separate thing. But from the perspective of reducing disinformation and in reducing polarization, I think those can be effective.
I mean, I try not to whinge about the media too much because everybody does it. But I suppose there is this question as well, going back to not just focusing on one aspect of the problem and trying to look at the bigger structures. I mean, is there a sense in which this kind of disinformation is propagated more in a certain media environment, whether
Yeah.
that's old corporate media or, to be honest, newer platforms, right? Because you've had like quite a rise of disinformation there and sensationalism and clicks and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started off with the older campaigns being mostly about denial around the human cause of climate change. currently it's often around delay.
Mm,
And what you see now, so things like gas is a clean alternative to coal.
mm.
It's still a fossil fuel, right?
Yes.
So,
I don't know how that happened.
so,
That's really
so it's a
weird.
transition fuel.
Yeah, yeah,
So, so you find these sorts of campaigns of delay, which sort of like still sort of create this idea that, there was in the US, there was a campaign which was rampant on social media, which was around, food tastes better with gas. So people were refusing to move to electric stoves because they thought food was tastier when cooked with gas. But that was
yes.
put up by a gas lobby, I think, or fossil fuel lobby. So, you've got like these sorts of interesting disinformation campaigns which diffuse through social media in particular ways. And it's very difficult to tell with corporate media or legacy media, okay, these are the people who own the paper, or this is the editorial line that you're willing to take. There's a bit more transparency there, but when you don't know which influencer is being paid for what, so it's quite difficult. And there's a different level of trust on social media. And we spoke about personal narratives. That's quite compelling on
Yeah,
social media because you want to give people the benefit of doubt. So apart from things like algorithms feeding you information you've already selected and so on. So in terms of the scope for disinformation to spread, my understanding is there's a potential for it to be much higher on social media, but legacy media has a really strong role in the sense of being able to already be credible messengers who actually spread a lot of the information in one sense. But the idea that we can choose our information environment increasingly and personalize it to our own interests, I think gets away from this idea of, we all have a right to believe what we want to believe, but it
yeah.
goes towards that sort of like we can create our realities, and it sort of fits into this whole like the commodification of the self in a way, right? Where
Yeah,
you
individualized. It's
individualize it.
as
Yeah.
the leader of the cult of unlearning economics, whose followers do his bidding.
Yeah.
I'm very familiar with this. But I mean, look, I mean, it's such a big problem, right? And I don't really stoke the parasocial relationship with my followers. It still exists because it's inevitable, and it's okay. But it's just like some online personalities are just like they literally lean into that so much, and you wonder, especially in America, if they would actually uh engage in violence for them. They literally follow them that strongly.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a big question as to how much behavior on social media influences behavior in the real world. I think in some cases, like voting behaviors and big public information campaigns, there is scientific evidence that it does. So they've done some evaluations of things like Facebook campaign evaluations and stuff, and found that actually the amount of money you spend does influence, the amount of people who you vote, and the type of nudging you do on that
Mm,
environment does influence that. In smaller scale studies that we've done, we haven't really seen a clear mapping. But when you think about it, but that might be because we've done one-shot studies where we've not looked at the long-term effects on behavior. If you think about people selecting repeatedly into the same information environment and changing their beliefs slowly over time, that could be quite different and quite profound.
mm,
Um, there was another, I forgot what paper it was, but there was also another paper which talked about how often in things like football matches, you often met people from the other side, or when people use public transport, you often were forced to contend with people who are quite different from you.
yeah.
And that induces a separate sort of understanding and conversational capacity, as well as willingness to exist with difference. Whereas if you have increasingly personalized bubbles where people are not opting into information environments which you sort of challenge or which are diverse, that changes the capacity to tolerate difference as well. I don't know about the scientific evidence for a lot of this stuff, but it's just interesting to think through what does it mean if we are increasingly in bubbles, and those bubbles present us with misinformation, which is increasingly difficult for us to decipher anyway,
Mm.
because you're so comfortable in that bubble. Because we do know that there is information avoidance. People do avoid information that makes them uncomfortable. That's definitely something that we have to contend with in the climate change space. So, yeah, I think this is a really important sludge in a way that we framed it in the paper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it the sort of online politics is just like such a, I think, a caricature of like how these real interactions that you were talking about on the train or at a football match might go, right. And I think it's just like, I mean, while I love memes, I do sometimes wonder if like everything's just being reduced to memes and there's not really all people do is just, I mean, I don't know, you're a bit less active online than I am, right? But it's like I just all people do is just meme and they just quip, right? And it's like that's not how normal people have conversations, right? It's really, really harmful. And I think it's just like completely siloed information, and it's a new type of disinformation, right? So maybe even that which we identified in the paper, because I guess we were talking more about the kind of legacy media and the corporate stuff, right? But it's just changing so fast, and I mean, I
We
don't
bring
know
up,
how to
we
address it.
bring up this, yeah, we bring up this interesting idea of moral wiggle room, which is the idea that when you've got competing bits of information or competing
Mm,
contextual, if you have the option to sort of opt out a little bit from being good, which in a way that's costly to you, you're able to sometimes exploit it to avoid taking the expensive personally,
mm,
pro-environmental action, right? So, I think what in misinformation and disinformation do is allow us to pull at these sorts of, whether it's a funny meme you saw, you feel good about yourself, and then you like sort of absolve yourself from responsibility. You could say like, oh, but other people are like this, or oh, that's just the way the world is, or whatever, right? Like, so I think in a way, it's important to also sometimes like abstract a bit from those information environments to really, because it's also like fast paced, isn't it?
yeah,
So
yeah, it's so fast. I mean, I
yeah.
always when I deleted my Twitter, but I
Mhm.
remember the phenomenon of logging into Twitter
Yeah.
and just having to backwards induce what had actually happened, because there were already 5 layers of irony over
Mm.
it. And I literally, I was just like, what's actually happened originally? I don't even know it, like, because the jokes are so like ironic and thick.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think this is also really interesting, right? Because it does feed some sort of need for community and belonging, and in relation to disinformation, that's how you do get, for instance, particular online communities providing a lot of meaning to people, especially in circumstances where things can be quite hard,
Mm,
right? And, COVID, it's difficult to meet people, but now even if it is, there are sort of these habits which are formed, and I think I'm thinking about like conspiracy groups like flat earthers and so in that sense, actually being feeling like you're part of an inside joke through the meme upon a meme upon a meme,
mm,
I think does give people a lot of sense of belonging and meaning, which they might not be getting from physical spaces in the same
mm.
way, or and I think that's another issue, which is why we were talking about, say, deliberative forms of engagement and greater community interaction and face-to-face interaction. It's not like those impulses are not there in face-to-face interaction. I think they
Of
just
course.
take on a slightly accelerated form in online spaces because things move quite quickly and there's quite a lot of feedback and there's so much anonymization.
Yeah.
So
A lack of face-to-face interaction just it's just completely different. I mean, I was reading about the decline of third spaces, right, which goes back to this idea of not necessarily brown infrastructure, but like just how nudge doesn't necessarily help when you don't have the choices, you don't have the physical spaces available, and just like libraries or something like that where you actually go and meet people, and now people do it online, right? And it's much more toxic than going to a library. Libraries are notoriously not toxic places, right? And you can go and speak to people who are different to you and who disagree with you and so on.
yeah, I think libraries, but also green spaces,
Yep.
is we have to have like good investment in accessible green spaces, because that's where people can access nature, and there are huge well-being benefits from that. But if you do have badly maintained parks or parks shutting down or not being well lit and things, these are just psychological factors which might put people off. And there's one way that there's a debate about whether you can use things like nature documentaries and virtual reality and stuff to connect people to nature. But there's also these sorts of initiatives coexist side by side, along with stats showing that people are increasingly biophobic because they don't interact with many animals
But
or
that means they actually don't like, they
there's a
fear
fear
the
of nature.
environment and like touching
So
a tree or something.
yeah, touching a tree might be less threatening, but things like yeah, but basically the idea that spending out time in nature is sort of unnatural in a way that it like you get
Yeah.
scared, or it's too unpleasant, or it's uncomfortable. So the idea that actually more and more time on tech can actually turn people away from this, what people initially thought was sort of an impulse to nature, right? And we think of ourselves as quite separate from nature in some settings, not in all. Like I think a lot of cultures which are indigenous really question nature-human duality, but I think at least in these sorts of sort of more Western weird contexts, Western industrialized, rich democratic countries, you think of more sort of humans versus nature sort of setup. But the idea of biophilia was that we have this innate connection with nature because we are part of nature and so on. But now we're seeing with greater sort of time spent indoors, especially on things like technology, biophobia might also be a reality where people are actually put off from spending time. And that increasing disconnection does mean that people are willing to spend less resources and less personal effort in protecting nature and doing things about climate change and biodiversity loss.
Mm.
So I think a lot of,
Biophobia.
yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't know that term, biophobia or biophilia. That's really interesting. I think
Two,
it resonates.
two Japanese scholars, Soga and Gaston, have done a bit of work on this. So for those interested, that would be an interesting place to start.
Mm-hmm. To place everything in context, I know we've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole with misinformation and the media and stuff, but what we're exploring really, because this conversation is about the limitations of green nudges, small changes in how choices are presented to people that can hopefully alter their behavior and improve the environment and combat climate change. And this is just really limited because there's just such a sea of restrictions, barriers, impediments, physical infrastructure that gets in the way of these kinds of behaviors, which we call brown sludge, right? And one of these is this disinformation and misinformation, and behavioral science and psychology more broadly can help with this a lot, I think. And I want, because there's a lot of research into beliefs, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we've been touching on here, really. But we've kind of looked into this and taught it, right? And I think there was, again, I get a bit frustrated because there was this whole thing about confirmation bias. Everybody knows what confirmation bias is, right? We seek out information that agrees with us. We dismiss information that doesn't. And you mentioned it there, or you alluded to it. It's real, but I think there was this approach to it where it's like people are individually biased. So how can we kind of deconfirmation bias them, perhaps with some kind of intervention? And I think there was this lack of understanding for why do people not change their beliefs when they're given one piece of information. There might actually be quite good reason for that. If you change your beliefs every time you're given some new information, then you won't have any beliefs, right? And if you don't have any beliefs, then you can't really function, right? To be honest, right? So there's this whole interdependence of beliefs, which is quite an interesting research area, and I think there's active research there.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I mean, what do you think of that? Do you recognize that area?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know much about this research area, but I think there is an idea that actually beliefs are layered on top of networks of other beliefs that you already have.
Mm.
And some of them might be really important to your sense of self, so your identity and things and so on, which is where I think things like online communities and networks can give people that sense of identity and community, whether it's an incel group or
Yeah.
flat earthers in some cases, but also if it's on learning economics community, right? Like, so in a sense, like there is something there which there's I think there's a form of, so one reason that people are hesitant to give up these beliefs is also those social relationships, is what I'm trying to say, or the social benefits that you're getting from holding those beliefs. So, and in that sense, I think that can be quite difficult to nudge away because how are you going to substitute social networks?
Mm.
Right? Because those do depend on interactions, and often those are self-selecting in the sense that people select into those sorts of interactions.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's just these much deeper problems. Which, to be honest, let's be fair. The social psychologists who were in our department would say we were already asking these questions, and then you came along with behavioral science and nudge, and now you're gradually rediscovering that you have to ask the same questions we've been asking for decades.
I think so, and I have a lot of sympathy for that, frankly,
Me
because
too.
I'm like, yes, you're right. So yeah, I can't really, yeah, they're right.
Yeah, yeah.
But but this is where I think maybe one of the things that behavioral science, I'm not trying to put a flag up for behavioral science, but I think this is one of the things that behavioral science explicitly tries to do, which might be implicit or less of a focus on, is this link to actual behavior, right? So what does
Yeah.
this mean for decision making in the real
Okay.
world, right? So I think in a sense, like people have looked at beliefs and confirmation bias and the structure of network beliefs and so on for a while. But often there might have been a conflation with intentions and actual behavior, or there might have been a conflation with attitudes and intentions and behavior, right? So something I think behavioral science, and maybe people disagree, and that's okay as well, but I think there is this explicit focus on actually, but what does this mean for real world choices? And typically what that means is using some sort of a field experiment or a randomized control trial to look at that causal effect on those choices. I think that's one of the things behavioral science brings in with a particular flavor.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of limitations with that way of thinking,
Yeah.
right? Because just because you measure behavior at one point in time doesn't mean that it's going to persist. Just because not everyone can do an RCT. Some cases it's quite difficult to do an RCT, and RCTs miss out a lot of things as well because you're forced to focus on a couple of things rather than the process of change. So there's a whole bunch of concerns around just relying on that methodology, but that's typically something which I think a lot of behavioral scientists might flag as what their contributions have been.
Yeah, I think that's even if people may disagree, it's probably the best defense of behavioral science that's out there, right? And it's in the name. That wasn't damning with faint praise, by the way. I really liked it as a defense of behavioral science because yeah, it's focused on behavior, and it was behavioral science really was behavioral economics was the intersection of economics and psychology, and now it's kind of mutated into behavioral science, which is maybe even more interdisciplinary. But that's the thing, that was the limitation of this kind of psychology, right? I think psychologists naturally were very focused on the mind, what people think, what they believe, how they feel, whereas economists were just like, well, we're just focused on behavior, but obviously their
They
models
would
were
use
very
the term
limited.
revealed preferences.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right, which is really interesting because psychologists don't have a
Mm.
construct like preferences. They have beliefs, they have affect, they have emotions, they have attitudes, but preferences don't mean anything in terms of a ranking.
Mm.
Like, but economists really do cling to the idea that their people might have ranked preferences and they enact those preferences, and that means there's this revealed choice. And there's I'm a bit rusty on that literature, but there is this question about what preferences are in terms of revealed versus stated, and
Stated, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
The,
It's put your money where your mouth is, right? Or actions speak louder than words. Actually, is better saying. Yeah,
yeah. But then the idea there is there's some sort of conscious process linking preferences to choices, right? Because they're revealed. I think a lot of psychologists might, I'm not going to I'm speaking as someone who's interdisciplinary, and that's my understanding. But my understanding, so I'm going to caveat that. But my understanding there is actually people can do things and then have some sort of a narrative justifying why they did it. And that might not be because they have a strong, clear preference about it.
yeah, yeah. I
Right. So
always think about.
theoretically,
Sorry.
you're on shaky ground
Yeah.
with the notion of preferences being revealed. Yeah.
I mean, like we said at the beginning of the conversation, right? You could think about like our careers and our paths through different disciplines, and it's quite easy to look back on that and be like, well, this is the reason that I did so many different things, right? And it's like, perhaps I could have got. I mean, you said you could have become a zoologist, right? Perhaps with a
Yeah, I
roll of
still
the
wonder
dice.
why I didn't.
Yeah.
I've just been at the bottom of the ocean somewhere studying some, I don't know, fish.
Is that
But yeah,
does that sound appealing to you? That sounds horrible to me.
it does.
I
It
think I'm
does.
biophobic then. That sounds so scary. I've
All
tried
this time
scuba
you
diving
spent
and I couldn't do it.
all this time you spent on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It literally is. Yeah. Yeah. You've got me. I'm going to go through an existential crisis about my biophobia now. Now that you've introduced the term.
You've got some plants at the back. That's some good,
Yeah,
like,
yeah. I've got quite a lot of
have
plants, but
action.
that's different. They're very contained and commodified, aren't they? The plants, right? It's like it's not actual nature.
Start
Yeah.
naming them to have a more personal relationship. But, yeah.
So I mean, so first, how long have I got you for? Because we've gone for over an hour now.
Yeah, it's I'm okay actually.
You're okay.
Probably
So
15
I mean,
minutes. Yeah.
let me ask you a very pointed
Depends on
question
how
that
bored
may get
people
you
are.
into. Yeah, yeah. People. I mean, to be honest, the amount of people watching has only gone up. We're on 150 now. So it's. I think people are okay. Somebody mentioned degrowth, which I might ask you about in a second,
Yeah.
but Let me ask you a very pointed question, which may get you into trouble.
Yeah.
Are nudges basically a failed paradigm?
A nudge is a failed paradigm. In the context of environmental climate change stuff, I think solely relying on nudges is a failed paradigm. Yes.
Okay. That's it.
Yes.
That's it. That's so true. That was a very unequivocal statement. Yeah, I
Because
mean,
and I think that for two reasons, right? One is if you're looking at this as the single shot silver bullet to the issue, that's not going to work, right? It just doesn't work. Because I think even in its original formulation, I wouldn't say even the most staunch sort of nudge theorists would argue that you do need other interventions because they might look at this as a case of market failure. And when you think about climate change as a case of market failure, you might have people have issues with that paradigm as well. So I'm not advocating that paradigm. I'm just saying like even the most hardcore economists would mostly argue for, and even the nudge theorists would mostly argue for multiple interventions, not just nudges. So I'm saying even as someone who's quite firmly, someone who might be firmly couched in the nudge literature might actually think that they would not be enough. The reason I say it's a sort of failed paradigm is if they're thought to the exclusion or thought as a silver bullet and as the easy way out, they're not. And I think they can be quite distracting. And they can also they might also perpetuate unintentionally or intentionally sort of views that this is an issue that can be solved by individual responsibility, which is not the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because nudge itself, and I know both you and I listen to the podcast If Books Could Kill. It is an airport book, and look, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein are both very prolific and serious academics who have produced a lot of really interesting work, and that was the basis for the book, right? But nudge itself, it was this kind of airport book, and it was, a neat idea here. This one cool trick solves everything. There was some dubious studies in it, which I think, I mean, there's that one about like you're putting a fly on the urinal reduces the amount of spray by 80%, and it's like, where did you get that from? Who gathered this data? Was it at the Bergheim in Berlin? Because like I just can't envisage what that lab experiment.
Wait, wasn't it in Amsterdam? I mean, I don't even know why.
I can't.
My brain has retained this bit of
Yeah,
information.
it was in Amsterdam.
Eject, yes. I think so. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, I cannot believe that you could ever find that out. But and it became a bit too much of a neat idea. And you and I have both taught, executive students, and I think one of the things that, as I taught the course for more and more years, I increasingly tried to hammer out of them was that nudge is this one neat trick that solves everything, because that's the mentality they come in with. And you're like, no, look, most nudges don't replicate. The effect sizes are really small. Behavioral science is so much more than that, or it can be.
Yes. And I think lots of people would argue that actually behavioral science interventions are not about nudging. That's a particular form which has come from, say, we're talking about Thaler and Sunstein's nudge, that comes from the space of libertarian paternalism, which is a framework which says that actually we need to, this is a third way, right? One that allows people to stick to the status quo. But that's slightly different from, most environmental economists, for instance, would say that you've got to fix the market. And that means price incentives, and price incentives are more effective potentially, implicitly, even if they don't say it, it's implicit, than regulation, right? Which is most paternalistic, right? So I would say that actually what we're actually facing with, and maybe most behavioral and psychological science people would say actually, but we've got a whole range of interventions which are rooted in psychological theory, which are not nudges, and we need to use all of them. So for instance, if you're talking about individual responsibility, you have things like commitment devices, you've got goal setting, you've got pledges, you've got like social commitments, you've got like a whole range of issues and devices where you can help individuals achieve their goals, both individually and collectively. You've got deliberative, like maybe typically this is not seen as a psychological intervention, but this is how I teach it in my course. You've got deliberative forms. We've been talking about citizens' assemblies, which will have an impact on behavior. You've got hardcore education, environmental education campaigns, getting people to spend time in nature. You've got other ways of volunteering, like citizens' assemblies, which will have its own knock-on effects on behavior. So I think from that perspective, you've got a range of interventions, and there's room to infuse all of them with psychological and behavioral insights, and to really assess whether they have long-term effects on behavior. And nudges is just one thing. And it's a good thing. Simplification is good. Like, removing frictions where they need to be removed is good. It's not redundant as an idea, but it's not your silver bullet, and it's definitely not going to address climate change, because that's just ridiculous.
Absolutely. I think, I think one of the contributions of Nudge, just to give it a roundabout defense, I think, was when I first read it, and bear in mind I was like, I don't know, 18 or something, but when I first read it, it did completely change my conception of choice. And I think it's the way it reframed choice was really interesting and valuable, because this idea of like choices are always presented to us in a certain way. There's no neutral choice, right? Because there's this paradigm, it's very popular in mainstream economics, but also I think it's culturally really prevalent, especially in Anglo-American countries, where it's like, well, people can make their decisions, right? And it's like, well, actually, what Nudge tells you is that people always make their decisions in a context, and that can be everything from whether the sweets are at the at the counter where they pay, to the broader social context, right, and the information and the beliefs they have. And I think that's a really valuable way. That's how I think about Nudge now, rather than just a narrow set of specific interventions.
So. But if you really pull that to its logical conclusion, then you do think about who sets that context and who designs that context, and why is it not neutral, right? And I think the idea that maybe people have the freedom to choose might be a bit limited, because it's not the case that everyone has the freedom to choose.
Yeah.
And it might be a comforting thought to think that might be the case. But if you do believe in the fact that contexts are not neutral and they are designed in a particular way, then you also have to think about how your choice is determined, and how do you get that power back to reclaim the choices or design the environment that you want, which you think is good for society, right? Or you think is good for yourself and then society, whichever way that you want to sort of frame that. And I think this is where it becomes less about, oh, but I have the freedom to do yoga and then recycle and then go to the park and jog. Like, then it becomes less about your individual choice, but also you exerting that social responsibility to help design that system in a way, whether it's exercising your power to vote or being involved in your local community groups. Because if you want to really address climate change, there is this collective dimension. And then, I think then it does mean that you have to take that power back and then think about, okay, how should we do this? And then you have to move from an I to we sort of setup in your mind, because you're not going to change your neighborhood by yourself, right? And in a way that I think is an important sort of switch to make. And then you could either, sort of delegate that power to some party that you want in a typical sort of voting democracy sort of setup, or if you want to get involved with local community and do things there and build a sense of community there, I think that's another way to do it. There are many ways to do it. I think when we think about what to do about climate change, I often want to sort of emphasize that actually there's a lot that we can do. It's not that the fact that there's no neutral context and you don't have the freedom of choice shouldn't necessarily, or freedom of choice can be a bit of a blinkered view. It should open up the things that you can do rather than close them down, right? Because it does mean that you can open up a bunch of actions that you can do. You could do all the things that, whether it's your diet change or your choice of travel, to the way you spend time thinking about politics or who you want to vote for, to the way you get involved in local community, because that means you do have the power to change your context in a way, because it's not neutral. So that means you should take ownership of that, I think, a bit.
It comes back to this question of governance, right? Which is kind of obsessing me at the moment, because I don't know. I feel like we don't really
have Stuart.
Sorry, what did you say?
Which is why it's good we have Stuart.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell us what to do about that.
Yeah, exactly. I definitely need to talk to Stuart, and I will do it at some point. But yeah, he's got. It's just how. We don't, I don't know, we don't think about governance really. I think a lot of, from the economy, through to other areas, right, there's this very hands-off approach, and I guess a kind of denial of social responsibility and how interconnected we all are, because even the basic economic theory says externalities need to be corrected, But I think the problem is that it doesn't necessarily recognize that externalities, I mean, they're just the norm. Like literally everything you do affects other people. And that's why you can't just have a tax on every externality and or a subsidy for a positive externality, right? It's like it's much more complex than that. We all affect each other constantly, and the future, people nearby, people far away, and we need to design governance structures in the vein of Ostrom, right, that actually deal with that reality. And unfortunately, that's not a simple or sexy proposal like Nudge was. It doesn't, it's not neat. It's not an airport book. It's actually probably quite tedious, right?
It
But that's
is
the truth.
tedious. That's the truth. And I think that I think when, yeah, I can't disagree with that, because I think it is the case that actually this does require actually sitting down and doing things and working together and trying different solutions, but also learning from those that fail and those that don't. So you have to have some sort of an implementation evaluation culture within that
Hmm.
organization and to do it. But that's also quite difficult for people because they have to work. There's a cost of living crisis, you have to take time out to do this. People might not know where to start. So I think, there are good constraints that people face, which, put limits on how much time they can devote for these things. So something I'm increasingly interested in studying on these sorts of time constraints rather than just money constraints, which also exists. But I think those sorts of time constraints are things where you can have a role for policy to sort of explore, right? Because those time constraints vary by different groups. Something else which is really interesting is basically the idea of limitarianism, which is basically limits on potential wealth and accumulation. So how many billions do you need to be happy, or how many
Mm.
billions do you need to, because those things also do mean if you have excess power, you also have excess power, not just in the marketplace, but also in politics. So the capacity for people to influence particular policy regimes, which have direct implications for climate change, also hinge on your monetary power. So, so I think there are ways that, we should be able to think beyond, just this individual responsibility, but also this idea of like, how do different groups in society operate? How do you put a check on these limits and things which are really interesting, which need to, I think, come into the agenda a bit more when we think about
Elon Musk is actually single-handedly settling the age-old question of whether money can buy you happiness. Because despite being the second richest man in the world, did you see that it was just revealed in court that he made alternative Twitter accounts that praise himself? So he like posts underneath and he's like about his divorce and stuff and how he's winning his divorce, and it's like money really doesn't buy you happiness. Like I'm sure a lot of
but
very
we
poor
know
people are much
this
happier than him.
we do know this as well from the data, right? That it does flatten after a point. So
Hmm.
money does help to an extent, but then after a point, and this is where the often one debate is like, what is that point and what is, but I think even if we don't think about what is the point at which that curve flattens, where you've got basically well-being and then money on one side, just to think of the extremes
Mm.
and think about actually how is money acquired at those extremes, and how can you repurpose that money towards actually addressing some of these societal issues, I think is really important.
I think what's not in dispute is that the gain for poorer people is just completely, massively outweighs any gain for richer people, even if there's a slight gradient, right? And also, I think one other thing which come out of that
Like the
literature is the
utilitarian.
importance of
Yeah.
social comparisons. That everyone agrees, right? That in a richer country where you're not destitute, really a lot of your enjoyment of your income comes from participating in society and being, comparing yourself to those around you. And so that's again something that can change. If you change the income distribution, you change that. You change people's expectations and their reference points.
I think Veblen, I mean,
Mm,
in his work about conspicuous consumption, like spoke about this a
mm,
while ago, right? The idea that actually conspicuous consumption means no one's ever going to be very happy because you're always going to look at the reference point above you.
mm, yeah.
Who's got a bigger yacht
Mm,
rather than, and that's because we compare ourselves all the time. So I think there is a case for, and I think that this stage of hyper, consumption that we're in, I think that's kind of the direction and aspiration, which is not really good for climate change, to be honest,
yeah.
because it's a never-ending cycle. I know there was a thing about degrowth, but
Mm,
yeah, I think that definitely feeds into that conversation.
yeah. I mean, I've talked about planned obsolescence on this channel, right? Because it's a really interesting case where things that we own just have objectively kind of gotten worse in terms of durability
Yeah.
and quality, and we don't really repair stuff anymore. You know, we just buy new stuff. Often it's cheaper. Often it's not available. The possibility of repairing, like you actually physically can't repair a lot of smartphones. Like you can't get the bits, you don't know the instructions, right? Apple or whoever don't provide you with the information, right? And they've been sued for that reason. But it's like the whole environment is just set up to encourage us to buy something more, and often frequently replace our smartphones every year, every couple of years, right? And it's just a massive problem. And not only is it obviously bad for the environment, because e-waste is just a huge problem, it really affects us as well. And I think sort of psychologically, we have really horrible relationships with, for example, our phones, right? Whereas if you imagine like somebody who has a really old phone that they've repaired loads of times, right? They might actually have a better relationship with it
Call them
psychologically
dumb
too.
phones now, I think.
What's
Yeah.
that?
We call them dumb phones
Dumb
now.
phones, yeah, exactly. Dumb phones, yeah. And
Yeah.
it's a whole social shift that we need, right?
Yeah. I think there is a movement towards voluntary simplicity in some circles, but also towards like dumbing down your phone and spending less time on it. I think those things are happening, but they're sort of happening in pockets. I think when we think about actually, there is a need to sort of combine those and mainstream those approaches in some sense, or at least have a greater conversation about the benefits of those approaches and why people are doing it. Something that people do pay attention to from a behavioral perspective is why people do things, not just what they do. For instance, we did an experiment where we found that the motivation matters, not just the social norm. So paying attention to the social norm would be things like why people do it or whether the other people think they ought to do it. Whereas the motivation is it nice to do? Is it fun to do? Am I having a good time doing it? Is this for the environment? And often that's the entire intuition behind likes, for instance.
Mm.
So I think when you think about well-being and you're thinking about actually people are happier without this, that might be a more convincing argument than you ought to do it or
Yeah.
people are doing it. So I think actually profiling more stories and mainstreaming those ideas, because a lot of this experimentation is happening on the ground. It's just that often they just don't get the airspace or time.
Mm.
So I think in a way it's limit you could use social media for this sort of stuff, but it has to sort of compete with other information like Elon Musk's multiple accounts. But but my point being like actually profiling and mainstreaming those stories is an important place to start,
Mm.
and sharing those experiences and those experiments as well. Because it does show that a lot of people are trying to do things on the ground. It's just that maybe they just don't get the airtime the same
Mm.
way.
It goes back to the if there's no dancing at the revolution, then I'm not coming, right? It's that type of thing. I mean, and speaking of probably good ideas that have kind of bad names, let's talk about degrowth directly, because I mean, you kind of hinted that you're something of a degrowther. So how do you see it, and what does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, so one of my PhD students, Della Sudel, she's doing work on degrowth, and we were basically looking at what is the link between more macro perspectives on degrowth, which talks about GDP and decoupling and things, and what does that actually mean from a behavioral perspective. So, for instance, and my other colleague Fred Basso, who he also
Hmm.
obviously he's involved a bit more. So actually, Fred and Dallas are a bit more in that world. But what we found was actually people don't often differentiate when we use more sort of degrowth and green growth sort of messaging. So we found that people, whether you talk about degrowth or green growth from a consumption point of view, people have the intention to reduce, but it's not about, yeah. So I think often at a baseline consumption level, often people don't differentiate between these two. But I think that you're right that degrowth does have a bad name. So I think some of Fred works, for instance, tries to look at actually reframing that and whether that is more appealing to people, for instance. Um, I think what is the question though? Is the question like what is my position on degrowth, or is the position, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose yes. The sort of pre-question to that was how do you see degrowth, right? Because as we were getting at, it sometimes means different things to different people, right?
Yeah.
And so, what's your version of degrowth, I suppose?
Yeah, I think the idea that infinite growth is possible is not credible, just because we will come against resource limits, but also growth as a principle by which we should organize society and policy is not as compelling to me as I think it's not the most attractive way to organize society because there's no automatic trickle down. And the idea of decoupling is also quite difficult to think about when we come up against hard limits and scientific predictions. And also the fact that often when we do think about, someone told me like 2050 is closer than 1990. So, and I bring up 2050 just because 2050 is when we have quite direct climate predictions coming up. Right. And we're seeing a lot of wildfires and things recently. And we're also seeing a lot of climate anxiety amongst people who are younger. And those are real issues, right? When we're thinking about resources, but we're also thinking about the well-being effects and how growth has actually served people recently. So I think from that perspective, I don't think growth should be and is a good organizing principle for society, right? That said, I do think that in particular places where you do have poverty and you do have things like energy poverty, growth is essential. So I think a lot of degrowth scholars would also say that we're mostly talking about affluent nations where you've got overconsumption rather than actually mitigating growth for poorer countries or populations, while recognizing there's a huge inequality within countries as well, right? So someone who's ultra rich in, say, in India and someone who's ultra rich here are more similar than someone who's, So I think that's something which is really important to come up against. But the idea that actually we should shift towards broader social foundations, I know you had Kate Raworth on, for instance. I think basically thinking about a different way to organize society which decenters growth is something that's really appealing to me. And the idea that overconsumption is actually pretty empirically, we know, like the data shows it's not good for well-being. It's not necessarily good for the environment. So from that perspective, I don't think the economic principle of more is better. I think that's not compelling either. So I think from that perspective, I have a lot of sympathy for degrowth. It just has it's just not as widely accepted. And I think operationalizing it at the individual level, like what that means for people, is something which is interesting to me. It could be things like repair, reuse, right, in terms of actual behavioral decisions. But also perceptions of degrowth and what that means for policy. So my work, another paper we've got with Dallas, shows that actually there's a lot of support for some degrowth policies in the US, which could be things like universal healthcare. It could be things like a 4-day work week and things like that. So those could be seen as degrowth policies. Something else which actually comes to mind is there's some work by Dan O'Neill which shows that actually degrowth, green growth, and other sorts of policies, there's some overlap in a lot of policies, which mean there's already space for people to start, implementing things where there's a lot of agreement. And I think I have a lot of empathy for that argument. Energy efficiency, things like renewables, there's already quite wide support across the board, irrespective of your position, that those are the policies that need enacting.
If you say things to people like, classic degrowth policies, moving towards renewables being the most obvious one, right? Less car-centric cities, more public transport, more
also
cycling.
Social equality, right? So
social equality,
things like actually having a working NHS, for instance, that would be seen as a package of degrowth policies, right? Things like actually having access to good quality education, because you need the social foundations to have a good environmental foundation too. So I think a lot of, you talked about framing and getting a bad name. I think when you think about degrowth, people always think about becoming poorer, and that means maybe negatively affecting people who are poorer off. But I think a lot of degrowth scholars would argue that it's actually putting the social foundations in place and then thinking about how to attack excess consumption and decentering growth instead. So from that perspective, I sort of do agree. Yeah,
definitely. I think it can get a bit pedantic about what exactly GDP means, right? And it's like, I guess there are two related concerns. One is like, do we actually, say we implemented all the good degrowth reforms that we were talking about, I don't know if aggregate global GDP would go up or down, right? Because some of those things, investment in renewables would increase GDP. Others might decrease it, right? If you reduce consumerism, right, and whatever, right? But on aggregate, and especially since a lot of GDP these days is kind of imputed, it's like actually a bit detached from what's actually going on. I don't know if that number goes up or down, so I can't say, oh, I think that we should have negative growth and that'll be good. I can say I think we should have all these policies which are degrowth policies, and whatever happens to GDP is fine, right? And the problem as well, which is related to this, is I think when you sell it as a negative GDP, a lot of people, some of them disingenuous, just say that you're trying to engineer a recession, which is like, I mean, it's stupid, right? But it is something you have to contend with.
Absolutely. And which is why I think a more focus on for me anyway, I think also because I'm not fully in the know about the dynamics of how those individual decisions would translate at a macro level. I just don't have that knowledge. But for me, intuitively, when I'm thinking about what do we need as a society to address climate change, but also improve the social welfare of people, then I think the policies on the table then mandates a question of how do you finance them. And often that has to come through like libertarian policies, like, a proper progressive tax, really like I know the wealth tax is off the table now, but it does mean funding like long-term investments in funding health, education, to have an informed electorate, you've got good evidence now that a 4-day work week actually doesn't necessarily reduce productivity. In some cases, productivity stays absolutely the same, but has a huge well-being benefit because people are given more time to spend with their kids or do the bills or whatever, right? So actually,
and an environmental benefit, I think
an environmental benefit, like to also like it takes time to get interested and involved and change local politics as well. So like I think actually trialing those policies slowly at scale and then learning from them in an incremental way would be the way to go, rather than stemming those policies which are actually quite compatible with what people also want and which are popular.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been talking for almost 2 hours. This has been really enjoyable, yes. But I think it's a good place to stop, right? It was quite an optimistic place to stop. I had a question about cost benefit analysis, but we can tear into environmental economics and Nordhaus some other time. But yes.
Thanks for having me on. It's really been a pleasure to talk.
Thanks so much for coming on, Ganga.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also thanks for those who were
thanks to everyone watching.
patient enough to listen to all this.
Yeah. Still, we've got almost 200 people, so it's gone well.
Yeah,
all right. I'll see you later.
Have a great day. The sun's out.
Yeah. I'm going to Brighton actually for the weekend, so it's going to be nice.
Maybe you'll get to swim there.
Yeah, I'm too biophobic.
You have to push yourself now. Do what you need. Have fun.
Yeah. Okay. See you later.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Have a good weekend. Bye.
Ooh. Okay, we are done. We're done. We've finished the chat, everybody. Thank you for joining, as usual. And I'll see you all around. I think before I do my Thomas Sowell video part 2. I might just, in the interim, have one about clean air and the environment, because 1, it'll be shorter, and 2, it'll be nice to talk about something good instead of just tearing someone down for like 5 hours. But I think, my conversation with Ganga has kind of further ignited that in me, and the research I did before I spoke to her. Anyway, see you all later.